So in the last video, we kind of talked about divine action, so things that God does, like healing, for example. And we kind of tried to come up with a way of describing what God does in Trinitarian terms. Well, one question that comes up, especially after, in the wake of the Pentecostal charismatic movement, starting in Azusa Street in the early 1900s, and really, changing the face of Christianity worldwide over the 20th century and out of the 21st century. One of the key questions that keeps coming up is the legitimacy of religious experience. And what we mean by that is we want to say, well, okay, yeah, it seems like God can do things, and we can have genuine religious experiences of God, of the divine, of the noumenal. But the question is, how do we distinguish? How do we know what the difference is between, something that someone just said and it's not real, it wasn't actually an experience of the Godhead, versus something that's absolutely true and a real mystical religious experience, assuming you believe in them. And there are Christians who will say things like, so I know people who will say that Julian of Norwich or whatever was a fraud, and that Julian of Norwich didn't actually have a revelation from God on her sick bed, that it was just her being crazy. Okay, well, how would we know? Like, what would be are there some differences? Are there some commonalities between religious experiences that might help us to say that one might be legitimate and that one might be Looney Tunes? Well, I think one answer to that question, or one way to go about that question, is to, if you start gathering questions, right? You start gathering examples of people who've had a deeply real religious experience. One of the things you notice is that it's always a story that it always starts with something difficult, challenging, scary, very possibly frightening, existential dread, a complete lack of provision, something that is deeply, deeply wrong, and deeply, deeply vulnerable, scary. It's a situation in life that's dangerous, right? And then the story of religious experience almost always goes, and then something happens, right? Something happens that is it's inexpressible. Like it can, there's some. It gets described a lot of ways, union with the divine, or just miraculous provision out of nowhere. I mean, you hear this all the time with missionaries. They'll be like, I just prayed, and I went to the mailbox, and there was a $500 check, which is just enough to pay the bills, that kind of thing. So there's this moment of radical disorientation, fear, vulnerability, danger, and then something that's inexpressible, unexplainable, divine union, and then there's right after that there's joy and an expression of safety and feeling cared for and united with God, deeply experiencing God's provision, love, what have you, and a sense of true peace, right? Peace and joy, right? So we start out, we're going through life, everything's cool, and then, oh no, bad things happen. Danger. And danger, 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 and then God shows up. And then joy and peace. And almost always praise. Can you read that piece? That says peace and praise. Well, not to harp on Lee too much, but gosh, that sounds a lot like how he describes divine and human liminality, right? He'll say, there's the first home, right? So if he had grown up in Korea and Korean culture, there'd have been home a place of true location. And then there's a venturing out, right, into American culture. It's dangerous, vulnerable, scary. God shows up. God, in some way, frees or does something to mitigate or take away that danger and relocates to the point that now there's a place of joy and peace that results in praise. And of course, what Lee does with that is he says, gosh, gee willikers, that sure does look like the incarnation, crucifixion and resurrection, doesn't it? He says, there's the sending by the Father of the Son in the power of the Spirit to a place of marginality, of liminality, of danger, vulnerability, possibility. And then there's, the complete collapse of all hope in the cross. And then there's the resurrection and ascension, the return and relocation, reorientation of Jesus into home. And then, wow, that certainly seems to be an economic description of how God works, right? God sends, God allows vulnerability, but the Spirit is always raising and glorifying and redeeming and reuniting and creating unity between God and human beings. What does this mean? It means this might be a model for us to say what's a genuine religious experience or not. Is the experience, get this, Trinitarian? Just as the divine being is manifest in the incarnation, crucifixion, resurrection, ascension of the Son in the Spirit, perhaps our own genuine experiences of the divine reflect that, are analogous to that. And maybe genuine religious experience follows something of this path, a place of radical dislocation, followed by a reorientation, relocation, thanks to God, which issues in joy, peace, union, and praise.